Los Angeles International Airport was as busy as ever. The air was filled with the sounds of rolling suitcases, hurried footsteps, and the loud voices of people talking on their phones. Announcements echoed through the halls, calling passengers to their gates. In the middle of all this noise, Sandra Bullock stood quietly in the first-class line, waiting to board her plane. She looked tired, very tired. Her hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes from too many long days and sleepless nights. She had been working for weeks without much rest. She didn't look like a glamorous movie star at all. Most people didn't notice her. They were too busy checking their tickets, making business calls, or worrying about their own travels. But a few people did see her, and their expressions changed when they did. Some of them raised their eyebrows. Others exchanged looks, whispering to each other. They didn't expect to see someone who looked so normal in the first-class line. Sandra felt their stares, but she ignored them. She clutched her boarding pass in her hand, feeling a little nervous. The past few months had been exhausting, day after day on film sets, traveling between locations, barely getting any sleep. She was looking forward to finally sitting down, closing her eyes and resting. A few seats away, Keanu Reeves sat quietly, unnoticed by everyone. He was wearing a worn-out black t-shirt and faded jeans, dressed just as simply as Sandra. But unlike her, nobody was looking at him. His baseball cap was pulled low over his face, making him almost invisible among the crowd. Keanu saw everything. His sharp eyes caught the way a fancy-looking woman in front of Sandra checked her expensive gold watch, then leaned in to whisper something to her friend. Both of them glanced back at Sandra, smirking. Their look said it all. What is she doing here? The first-class waiting area was different from the rest of the airport. It wasn't just about the seats, it was about the people. Here, expensive perfumes filled the air, and the soft rustling of silk scarves mixed with the sound of important phone calls. People dressed in designer clothes, their shoes spotless, their hair perfectly styled. In the middle of all that, Sandra stood like an outsider. Her comfortable sneakers, her simple jeans, her tired face, she didn't fit in. But despite that, there was something strong about her. She didn't shrink away or try to make herself smaller. She just waited, calm and quiet, for her turn to board. Then Catherine Whitmore, the lead flight attendant, approached the line. Catherine had been working in first class for over 15 years. She carried herself with confidence, her uniform perfectly pressed, her makeup flawless. She knew how to handle important passengers, how to make them feel special. But she also knew how to put people in their place. When she reached Sandra, she hesitated. Her eyes swept over Sandra's simple clothes, her tired face. First class? Catherine asked, raising one eyebrow. I think economy class boards in 30 minutes. Her voice was polite, but there was something sharp in her tone. Other passengers turned to look. Some of them smiled slightly, entertained by the moment. Sandra didn't let it bother her. She held out her boarding pass. Yes, first class, she said, her voice calm and steady. Catherine took the ticket and looked at it carefully as if checking for a mistake. Her fingers tapped against the paper. Well, Catherine finally said, her lips curling into a small smile. We do have certain standards in first class. I trust you'll meet them. The meaning behind her words was clear. You don't belong here. Some passengers nodded in agreement. Others shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with Catherine's tone but too afraid to say anything. Keanu, now seated in 3C, clenched his jaw. He had known Sandra for years. He had worked with her, laughed with her, seen her kindness. Watching her being treated this way made his hands tighten into fists. But he stayed quiet. Not yet, he told himself. As passengers started boarding, Catherine stood near Sandra, watching her like a hawk. Your seat is 2A, Catherine said loudly, making sure others could hear. It's unusual to see someone so casual in our premium cabin. Sandra didn't respond. She just nodded, adjusting the strap of her carry-on bag. The weight of the last few months sat heavy on her shoulders. People walked past her, some pretending not to see what was happening, others openly staring. Catherine wasn't done. A few minutes later she returned, standing beside Sandra's seat with an overly sweet smile. Would Madame like to freshen up before we serve champagne? She asked, her voice loud enough for other passengers to hear. We do have some basic amenities available. Sandra looked up from her book, which she had only been pretending to read. She knew exactly what Catherine was doing. No, thank you, she said softly but firmly. I'm comfortable as I am. Catherine's fake smile didn't fade. Of course, she said. But, sometimes people find themselves in first class by unusual circumstances. An upgrade. A mistake. A lucky break. She let the words hang in the air before continuing. "It's nothing to be embarrassed about," she said with a slight smirk. "But next time you might want to dress more appropriately for the experience." Silence filled the cabin. The businessman in 2C coughed awkwardly. A woman across the aisle quickly looked at her phone, pretending she hadn't heard anything. Sandra's hands trembled slightly as she placed her book down. But when she spoke, her voice was strong. "I don't believe a person's worth is decided by what they wear," she said quietly. Catherine's smile turned colder. "Of course not, dear," she said smoothly. "But I'm sure you understand that we have certain expectations in first class. We want all of our passengers to have the best experience possible." She looked around at the other passengers as if reminding them that Sandra didn't belong. Sandra felt the humiliation burning inside her. She knew what Catherine was doing, trying to make her feel small, trying to make her regret sitting in first class. Some passengers started whispering. Others pulled out their phones, sneaking pictures of Sandra, probably hoping to post something online. Keanu saw it all. He saw the way Sandra's shoulders stiffened. He noticed how she blinked too much, as if trying to hold back tears. He saw the way her fingers curled around the armrest, gripping it tightly. And he was done waiting. Catherine had no idea who she was dealing with. Not just with Sandra, but with him. She turned away, moving through the aisle with a stack of magazines in her hands. One by one, she handed them out to passengers with a warm smile. But when she reached Sandra, her expression changed. She held out a glossy luxury travel magazine, her fake smile back in place. "Perhaps this will help you understand the usual standards of first-class travel," she said sweetly. Keanu put down his newspaper. It was time for Catherine to learn a lesson she wouldn't forget. Sandra didn't seem to fit in this fancy and expensive world. The other passengers in first class were dressed in designer clothes, wearing expensive jewelry and holding fancy drinks. But Sandra was different. She wore simple clothes, had a small backpack, and didn't try to impress anyone. Some people whispered behind their hands. Others giggled and smirked. A few just looked away, feeling uncomfortable but choosing to stay silent. Even though the flight attendants were supposed to be polite and professional, one of them, Catherine, wasn't being very nice to Sandra. She rolled her eyes, made rude comments, and treated Sandra like she didn't belong. What no one knew was that Keanu had been watching the whole time. He had been patient, hoping things would change, but now his patience had run out. Something in him shifted. The quiet man who had been calmly observing everything was about to speak. And when he did, no one on that plane would ever forget it. Just as Catherine was about to make another mean comment, a strong but calm voice stopped her. "I think that's enough." Even though the words were spoken softly, they were filled with power. The entire first-class cabin turned toward the voice. Keanu Reeves stood up, removing his cap. It was like the air in the room had changed. His presence suddenly filled the space. Catherine, the flight attendant, froze. Her usual perfect, polite smile cracked for the first time. Her confidence faded. Some passengers gasped. Others fumbled with their phones, trying to secretly record what was happening. But Keanu didn't pay attention to them. He wasn't here to perform for an audience. His eyes, usually warm and kind, were now serious. He looked straight at Catherine. "Miss," he said in a steady voice, "I've been watching you embarrass my friend for 20 minutes. He motioned toward Sandra. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise and relief. "A friend who, by the way, has shown more class by staying silent than you have with all your words." Catherine's face turned bright red. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to form a sentence. The other passengers who had been laughing earlier now sat in stunned silence. Some of them looked down at their hands, realizing their own mistakes. "Mr. Reeves," Catherine stammered. She looked panicked. "I didn't know. I didn't realize." She glanced nervously between Keanu and Sandra. And then, suddenly, something clicked in her mind. She finally understood who Sandra really was. "Miss Bullock," she whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't mean." But Keanu wasn't finished. He stepped into the aisle, his movements controlled and powerful. "You didn't know she was Sandra Bullock," he said. "And that makes it okay?" He let the question hang in the air for a moment. Would it be different if she were someone else? Does a person's worth depend on how famous they are? Or what they wear? The plane was silent. Even the usual humming sound of the engine seemed quieter, like the plane itself was listening. Sandra wiped her eyes, watching her friend. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but this time they weren't from sadness. They were from gratitude. Keanu continued, his voice softer now, like a teacher explaining something important. "I've known Sandra for years. We've worked together. We've laughed together. We've supported each other. And in all that time, she has never once judged someone based on their looks or money. She is always the first to help, the first to be kind, the first to lift people up instead of tearing them down. Catherine stood frozen, her serving cart completely forgotten. The passengers who had joined in on the laughter earlier now looked ashamed. Some of them fidgeted, unable to meet Keanu's or Sandra's eyes. But you, Keanu turned back to Catherine. His voice was still calm, but it had an edge that made everyone listen. You thought that because you wear a uniform and have a job here, you had the right to make someone feel small. And for what? To impress these people? To make first class look a certain way? Sandra gently touched his arm. Keanu, it's okay. You don't have to. No, Sandra. It's not okay, Keanu interrupted gently but firmly. It's never okay to treat anyone this way. Then he looked around at everyone in the cabin. True class isn't about expensive clothes or how much money you have, he said. It's about how you treat people, especially when you think they can't do anything for you. His words struck something deep inside everyone. Some passengers had tears in their eyes. Some nodded in agreement. Others quickly typed on their phones, probably sharing what they had just witnessed. Catherine looked down, completely ashamed. I'm so sorry, she whispered, looking between Sandra and Keanu. I was wrong. Keanu's voice remained steady. Don't apologize just because of who we are, he said. Apologize because what you did was wrong. And next time, remember that every person who walks onto this plane deserves kindness and respect. The passengers who had ignored Sandra before now saw her differently. But the truth was she had always been the same person. It shouldn't have taken her being famous for them to treat her with respect. The rest of the flight was completely different. Catherine disappeared into the back of the plane, only coming out when she had to. The other flight attendants seemed extra careful to treat everyone kindly, especially Sandra. Sandra and Keanu spent the rest of the flight quietly catching up. Every now and then, another passenger would come up to them, not to ask for a picture but to apologize. Some admitted they should have spoken up earlier. Others simply thanked Keanu for reminding them what real kindness looked like. As the plane landed, Catherine gathered her courage and walked up to them one last time. Her eyes were red like she had been crying. Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves, she began in a soft voice. I know my first apology wasn't enough, but I want you to know I've been thinking about every person I've ever judged, about all the times I made assumptions. Sandra looked at her with kindness. We all make mistakes, Sandra said gently. What matters is what we learn from them. Keanu nodded. The hardest person to face is ourselves, he added. But instead of feeling bad, use this to be better. As passengers got off the plane, something amazing happened. People didn't rush. Instead, they helped each other. Some picked up bags for strangers. Others smiled at people they had ignored before. It felt like for a moment there was no first class or economy, just people being kind. In the airport, a young girl walked up to Sandra. She clutched a small, worn backpack, just like the one Sandra had carried. I saw what happened, the girl said shyly. I just wanted to say, you taught me something today. My mom always says I have to dress up to be treated well. But you showed me that real respect comes from how we act, not what we wear. Sandra hugged the girl. Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were happy tears. Because sometimes, the hardest moments teach the most important lessons. The story quickly spread online. But unlike most celebrity stories, this one was different. It carried a deeper message. Catherine never forgot what happened. In the months that followed, she became known for her kindness. Every day, she kept a small note in her uniform pocket. It said, "Look with your heart, not your eyes." And that's what this story reminds us. True class isn't something you wear. It's something you show through your kindness, your actions, and the way you treat others. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what you think. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories filled with adventure, mystery, and excitement. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these stories coming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.